Hello and welcome back. In last week's video we looked at really precise ways to make selections and apply them to images for things like replacing skies. In this video we're going to show you some really simple and quick ways to make selections using the power of luminosity. So let's get a cup of coffee and get started. In the last video we looked at this image and we made a really precise selection to replace the sky. But in this video we're going to try something a lot simpler and use the power of luminosity masking to take an image that looked initially like this and turn the lights on and make it much more exciting. So let's get started and let's take the first step, and we'll turn those layers off and we'll start afresh from our base layer. Now the first thing we want to work with here is we want to make a selection of the shadows and the highlight areas to do some adjustments independently. So the first thing we're going to use, rather than try and pick out a selection using one of those selection tools, we're going to go straight to the select menu, come down to select by color range, and we're going to look at selecting by highlights. It's a bit confusing when you talk about using the color range selection tool, but you can use it for highlights, midtones or shadows. So let's click on highlights, and we have a range slider that chooses our range of what we consider to be a highlight, and you'll see that if I keep it right over to the very brightest tones, only a few areas are selected. But what I want to do is I want to pick out the brightest parts of these rocks in the foreground and add a little bit more sunlight to them. So by moving our slider further back and further back, we gradually bring more of the image into the selection. And so what I really want is just those really brighter highlights. We also have a fuzziness slider that allows us to select a little bit either side of that range. So somewhere about here looks good to me. Click OK. We now have a selection made. Now one of the things with luminosity selections is they can be very precise. In this instance we don't need it to be that precise, so what I'm going to do is go up to the select menu again, click on modify, and I'm going to feather that selection, and I'm going to just use 5 pixels to feather that to soften the edges a little bit. And now with that selection active, I'm going to create a new blank layer above my background layer by clicking on the new layer icon in the bottom toolbar. That creates a new blank layer, and to that I'm going to add that mask as that selection as a mask. And if I hold down Alt and click on that selection, you can see now that I've got a number of the areas of the rocks selected, and I've also got some water selected and the sky. We'll come back and modify that a little bit later. So click down Alt, click on the mask again to take us back to our normal layers. Now with this blank layer I'm going to fill this with a warm color to add a little bit more sunlight into the image. Now you could sample the bright sky up in this part of the image, but I've already made a sample by clicking on my foreground color and choosing a hue of color and a saturation. So I'm going to be okay with that. And next I will go and get my paint bucket tool. Now on your toolbar it may not be visible, but if you come down and hover on this 3 little dots icon, that will open up a whole lot of other tools that you can select from. These are ones that are not used so often. We want the paint bucket tool, so click on that, and now what we will do, click anywhere on the image, and that fills that layer with our orange sunlight color. Now at this stage it looks terrible, but we're going to modify that. First thing we do is we go back to our layer and we change the blending mode from normal to color. So that means that we don't overwrite the information below with the solid color. We're just blending the color of this layer with the layer below, and instantly you'll see it's a lot better. But the secret of this technique is in its subtlety. So what we do is we go to our opacity slider. If we just hover on the word opacity, click with our left mouse and drag, we can just drag the opacity down. Now somewhere between 15 and 20% is a good figure. So let's just try that, and if I turn that layer off and on, you'll see that the effect is quite subtle. If you want a little bit more, you can go a little bit higher, and in this example we'll keep it a little bit higher just to make it easier to see on screen. So the next thing I want to do is I want to cool down the shadows, because in the real world, as we see things around us, shadows don't have any illumination from the sun. They're illuminated by the blue sky. So what I'm going to do now is go back to our image layer, make a new selection by going to the Select, Color Range menu, and this time, instead of highlights, I'm going to come down and choose shadows. And we have the same set of sliders. We have a fuzziness slider and a range slider, and you'll see here on this screen that I've selected only a very small range of the darker tones, and we'll just tweak that a little bit. Again, this is something you have to decide based on what's in the image. Click OK to load that as a selection. You'll see now that all of the darker areas are now covered with marching ants, and we'll go back and we'll do the same thing. Select, modify, feather, 5 pixels works in this instance. We now have another selection active, and we're going to come down, create another blank layer, and that will sit, it doesn't matter whether it sits above or below the warmer color layer, because we're blending different parts of the image. And this time I'm going to add that selection as a mask to that layer, and if we hold down Alt and click on that layer, we see, yes, we've got all the dark parts of the image selected. So Alt click again to deselect that, click once to select our blank layer that now has nothing in it, and you may have already guessed what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my active color, and I'm now going to choose a cool color to fill the shadows with, and I think it's somewhere in these blues like this. And of course you can change this if you don't like what the color you selected. You can always go back and choose it again. I've now got my paint bucket tool active. Click on that, and you'll see now that all of those shadows look horrible, filled with a blue color. But wait, we do the same thing. We come back, we blend to luminosity. No, we blend to color, because we're blending the color of this layer with the information below. And again, come back to our opacity slider and way back down to somewhere between 15 and 20%, and you'll see now that I've got a separation between the colors in my highlight areas and my shadow areas, and that helps to build up the impression of the third dimension. So now we have a cool shadow area and a warmer highlight area, but let's say we're not totally happy with that, any of those colors. Let's just say not so happy with that blue color, I want to change that. So with that layer selected, we come back to our active color, our foreground color, click on that to open our color picker again, and let's say we wanted something a little darker. We can modify that, click OK. That now becomes the new active foreground color. Just click on the paintbrush or the paint bucket, and it instantly fills that layer with that refined color. We can do the same with the warm tones. Of course, we had the blue color selected. Let's come down and let's say we want something a little more orange, a little more punchy. Click OK, paint bucket on that layer, and again we've got the area filled with the new color. Now, one of the problems I can see with this image so far is that we've warmed up the highlights, but we've also added quite a lot more color into that sky, and I really don't feel that needs that in that sky. So let's just modify that. We don't need to do anything fancy with any of the advanced tools. We just come over to our mask, we hold down our Alt key, click again on the mask to load that onto the image, and we're going to use our trusty paintbrush tool to paint that out. Now, one thing you may find that when you're working on your image, you've selected the paintbrush tool, but hang on, you can't see the size of the paintbrush. Even if I reduce it down, all I'm seeing is a little crosshairs. The problem here is if you have the caps lock key on, you will only see the crosshairs. If you click the caps lock off, you will then see the circle of your paintbrush. Now, all I really want to do is I want to take that extra bit of warmth out of the sky because it's already quite warm enough. So I just come down, reset my foreground and background colors, click on X to select black, and let's just put the opacity up to 100% to make it simple, and we can just paint in where we don't want it. bearing in mind that the only areas we really want to add that warmth to is the foreground rock. So paint that in. I'm not being too precise because this area doesn't really matter. You can see that it's taking that out of the sky pretty easily. I think I've got that pretty well sorted out now. So we come back with our mouse over the mask, hold down Alt, click on again, and we've taken that off, and you'll see now that the sky has kept its original color, and yet I've now got a reflection of the sky in this bit of highlight in the water, so it's now picking up the warmth of the sky and it's starting to look a little better. And the next thing I'm looking at is overall the image needs a little more contrast. So with our color adjustments made, let's go now and add a curves layer, and let's just pick a fairly mild contrast adjustment, and you can see instantly that it does give the image a little bit more punch. We could maybe just squeeze that a little bit more either way, just to give it a little bit more punch. Now, as we know, every time we do a tonal adjustment to the image, we do affect the saturation, but here I'm quite happy with a little bit of increase in saturation because we're trying to give this a little bit more presence. So that's looking fine. And looking at the image now, I have this lovely leading line going through, but in the distance this little island is lost in the shadow, so I want to brighten that up, and we're going to use some easy selection tools here. We're just going to create another curves adjustment layer, and what I would do is I'm going to zoom in on this little island, and I'm just going to look at that and see if I brighten that up considerably. I really want to put a bit more light on it, but I'll need a bit of contrast. I'll need to tweak the shadows a little bit just so that we don't have it just totally washed out. Ignoring the rest of the image, come over to our mask, click on our mask, invert that mask, and now we get our paintbrush tool again, this time with white. So we hit the X key to select white as our active layer, make the brush a little smaller than the size of the image, part of the image that you want to adjust. And so we can just start to paint some sunlight back into this little island to give us a little bit more interest in this part. And it's starting to look a lot better now. We can paint this in a little more precisely if we really want to, but it's probably fine as is. Let's just turn that off and on to have a look. I've gone a little bit overboard on the edge, so if I just go X to swap my colors to black, and I'm going to paint that edge back out. And one of the things you'll see that the island looks a little bit dead compared with the foreground, so let's just now add to that a hue and saturation adjustment and put a little bit more color into that island. Now I could go in and repaint this selection on, but here's a little simple trick that we can use. Let's just improve or increase the saturation a bit so we've got a little bit more life in that area, and instead of recreating this mask on that I used on the curves layer, what I can simply do is on this hue saturation adjustment layer, I am just going to right mouse click on the part of the layer that's not the title or the mask, and I'm just going to say create a clipping mask. Now a clipping mask restricts the effect of the adjustment to what's on the layer below. So you'll see now when I add that extra saturation, it's now picking up what's on this island. The problem you have to be careful with though is if I've changed my blend mode on my curves adjustment to say luminosity, and because hue saturation doesn't have anything to do with luminosity, the adjustment's going to have virtually no effect. So you need to make sure that the blend mode remains the same on these two, and I think I can probably tweak that a little bit more, give it a little bit more effect, and then we can see we've added a lot more sunlight into that area, and that's looking a lot better already. Now that we've got the color and tonality looking pretty good in this image, it's time to have a look around the edges of the frame and see if there are any issues we need to address. And I can see straight away that down in the bottom left hand corner we have an issue with some old oyster shells that are catching the light and are quite a distraction at the edge of the frame. So I could make an adjustment layer and just paint this whole area in, but it's going to look fairly clumsy. So let's go back and use our trusty select color range tools and make a new selection that we can then apply to just that area. So coming back down, make sure you're working on the background layer before you make a new selection, because if you're working on one of these other layers, you may well replace your previous selection with the new selection inadvertently. So working on the background layer, come up to select color range, and we're going to select our highlights, and just looking at this area of the image, we can see that that selection is pretty good. We can just adjust it a little bit one way or the other. I'm not worried about the rest of this area because this is quite isolated. I just want to make sure that I'm getting a good selection around here. So click OK. I now have a new selection loaded. I'm just going to go back to select, modify, and just feather that, but only a couple of pixels this time because it's only a small area. And let's just now add a new layer, an adjustment layer above where we were working, and I'm just going to create a new curves adjustment layer. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the power of blending modes to do some of the work for me. If I go to multiply blend mode, it already darkens that part of the image. Let's not look at the rest of it at this stage. Let's just look at the part of the image that we want to look at, which is this part here. And let's have a look at how we can modify that curve to bring the tonal values down. And if I bring this down quite dramatically, we can see that these shells now are quite dark, and we've pretty well got that under control. So now with the image back in view, we can see that the rest of it looks terrible. Let's go Alt, click on the mask, and let's get our trusty brush, and this can be done in a matter of a few seconds. Remember, if you have your caps lock key on, you won't see the size of the brush. Now here we can use a very large brush because we want to paint out everything with black except for this bottom corner. So select black as our foreground color, 100% opacity. We can get our flow right up to pretty high value, and let's just paint that out. It only takes a couple of seconds to do this, but we just need to be a little more careful once we get down to the areas we're working on. So this is a really quick way to control this. Reduce the size of our brush as we get down close to the area we want to work with. Everything else is now filled with black. Hold down Alt, click on the mask again, and by turning that layer off and on, we can see now that little distraction down the bottom corner has now completely disappeared, and we're getting pretty close. And the last thing that we're going to do to this image is an incredible little trick of using the luminosity values of the image to totally turn on the lights and make this image stand out really well. Now the last thing we're going to do to this image is we're going to paint in some liquid sunshine using a technique called reverse overlay or inverse overlay masking. And there's a few steps to this, so I'll work through it quite slowly, and we'll start off by going to the top of the layers that we've already created. And what we want to make firstly is a composite layer of all the work that we've done previously. So to do this, we use the Control, Alt, Shift and E keys on our keyboard, and that creates a new composite layer above all else. So that's Control, Alt, Shift and the E key, and that creates this new composite layer. Now with this composite layer, we're going to inverse or reverse the luminosity values of the image and then blend it in such a way that it will just magically turn on the sunshine. So with this layer selected, we come up to our image adjustments menu, and we never ever use this on our image normally. It's only on some of these special techniques that we would go and use these adjustments. So image adjustments, the first thing we want to do is we want to get rid of the color out of this layer because we're using the luminosity values only. So we come across to the saturation values, take it down to 0. We've now got a monochromatic version of our image. And then the next step we're going to go to is back to image adjustments, and this time what we're going to do is invert that and create a negative version of our image. And the next trick is to go to the filters menu, and we come down to the blur selection, Gaussian blur, and we blur that image with a value of around 250 pixels. Now you can vary this a bit depending on the image, but 250 is a good starting off point. So with that selected, you'll see that if we go back to 0, there's no blurring. We can simply just type in 250. We've got our value. It looks quite unremarkable at the moment. We click OK, allow that to generate the blur of that image, remembering that this is still an image layer. And how we turn the lights on is we use the power of blending modes to turn the lights on, and we come down and we choose overlay blend mode, and wow, look at that, the sunlight has been turned on. Now this affects the whole of the image, so you might decide that, well, I like the effect but only on parts of the image, so simply we can just add a layer mask to this image. And in this case I'm going to add a layer mask, but if I hold down the Alt key when I click on to add the layer mask, it adds a layer mask filled with black, so now my effect is totally invisible. And so with the black filled mask, I get my paintbrush tool and my white color, and let's say we just leave it at 100% and we just paint the sunshine in on the areas where we want it. And this works really well on a lot of images, and it doesn't work at all on others. So I recommend what you do is give this a try on images where the luminosity values need a little bit of help, just to bring them back to life. And all I'm doing is painting in all of these foreground rocks very roughly with my brush, and you'll see now that even down this little bit of foreground I've got sunshine coming back into the image. And if you think that that's a little bit too strong, we can just simply go back and dial back our opacity till we get something that we're happy with. And somewhere like that looks really good to me. And that is how we turn on the sunshine in an image without having to go and make really precise selections. We're using very simple luminosity based selections and a little bit of brushwork, and we've made an image that really looks quite remarkable. If we go back to how we started, this was pretty flat and uninteresting, and we've now added a whole lot more interest to the image. So I hope that's been useful. Come back again soon and look out for more videos coming very soon.